On the morning of September 16, 1852, the overseer at Harrison Plantation in rural Georgia discovered that Eliza, the 24-year-old enslaved woman who served as the plantation owner's personal house servant and who was known throughout the county as Harrison's favorite, had vanished during the night without leaving any trace of where she had gone or how she had escaped. Robert Harrison, the 48-year-old widower who owned the plantation and who had owned Eliza since her birth, responded to her disappearance with a rage and desperation that shocked even people who were accustomed to slaveholders. Violent reactions to escaped enslaved people. Harrison immediately offered a reward of $500 for Eliza's capture and return, a sum that was more than 5 times what rewards for escaped enslaved people typically offered, and that indicated both Eliza's extraordinary value to Harrison and his determination to recover her regardless of cost. He mobilized slave catchers from 3 states. He had bloodhounds brought in to track her scent. He interrogated every enslaved person on his plantation and on neighboring properties, trying to determine if anyone had helped her escape. And he sent letters to sheriffs and to Underground Railroad watchers throughout Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, warning them to watch for a young, light-skinned black woman traveling alone or with accomplices. The search for Eliza consumed 3 weeks and involved hundreds of men who combed the countryside looking for any sign of her. And then, on October 8, 1852, 23 days after her disappearance, an overseer searching a storage building on Harrison's own plantation property made a discovery that was far worse than anyone had imagined. Before we descend into the horror of what happened to Eliza and why her story represents one of the darkest truths about slavery's violence, hit that subscribe button right now, smash the notification bell, and drop your state in the comments below. This is Epic of Fear, where we expose the cruelties that history tried to bury. Eliza had been born on Harrison Plantation in 1828, the daughter of a woman named Ruth, who worked as a field hand and who had been owned by Robert Harrison's father, Thomas Harrison, who had established the plantation in the early 1800s. Eliza's paternity was never officially recorded, but it was widely understood both within the enslaved community and among white people in the area that Thomas Harrison was Eliza's biological father, making her the half-sister of Robert Harrison, even though the law recognized no such relationship and classified Eliza as property rather than as family. This pattern of slaveholders fathering children with enslaved women was so common throughout the antebellum South that it barely warranted comment, though the resulting mixed-race children occupied a complicated and often tragic position in the social order. They were legally enslaved despite having white fathers. They often received slightly better treatment than darker-skinned enslaved people because of racist assumptions about lighter skin indicating superiority. But they also faced particular vulnerabilities, including sexual exploitation by white men who saw them as more desirable than darker women, and resentment from white women who saw them as evidence of their husbands' or male relatives' infidelity. Eliza's light skin, which reflected her mixed racial ancestry, and her features which observers described as refined and almost European in the racist language of the time, made her both more valued and more vulnerable than she would have been. if she had been darker skinned and less conventionally attractive by white beauty standards. Eliza's early childhood, from birth in 1828 through approximately 1838, when she was 10 years old, was spent in the slave quarters with her mother Ruth, and was probably similar to other enslaved children's experiences in terms of inadequate food, minimal clothing, and the constant awareness that she was property rather than a person with rights or protections. But around 1838, when Thomas Harrison died and Robert Harrison inherited the plantation, Eliza's circumstances changed dramatically. Robert, who was 18 years old when he inherited, and who had apparently developed an inappropriate interest in Eliza even before his father's death, removed Eliza from the quarters and from her mother's care, and brought her into the main plantation house to be trained as a house servant. This separation from her mother when Eliza was only 10 years old was traumatic, and was intended partly to break any familial bonds that might have given Eliza's support or identity outside of Robert's control. Over the next few years, Eliza was trained in the skills expected of elite house servants, including cooking, cleaning, sewing, and personal service to the white family. The concept of a slaveholder's favorite. Enslaved woman was a euphemism that everyone in the antebellum South understood, but that polite society did not acknowledge openly. A favorite was an enslaved woman who was sexually available to her owner, who often lived in or near the main house rather than in the slave quarters, who received better food and clothing than other enslaved people, and who sometimes wielded informal influence over plantation operations because of her relationship with the master. This arrangement was rape, regardless of whether the woman appeared to consent or even to welcome the relationship, because an enslaved woman had no legal or practical ability to refuse her owner's sexual demands without risking severe punishment, including sale, physical violence, or death. The favorite system was particularly insidious because it created a category of enslaved women who appeared to benefit from their position and who might even be resented by other enslaved people for their relative privilege, but who were actually trapped in a form of sexual slavery that was often more psychologically damaging than field work because it required them to perform not just labor, but also intimacy with men who owned them as property. White women, particularly slaveholders' wives and daughters, often directed their anger about their male relatives' sexual exploitation of enslaved women toward the enslaved women themselves, rather than toward the men who were actually responsible, creating additional dangers for favorites who could face violence from jealous or resentful white women. By the time Eliza was 15 or 16 years old, around 1843 or 1844, she had become Robert Harrison's mistress, in fact, if not in name. Robert was in his early 30s and had married a woman from a neighboring planter family, but this did not end his sexual relationship with Eliza. Instead, it created a household arrangement where Eliza served as both a house servant and as Robert's concubine, while Robert's wife Eleanor either did not know about the relationship or pretended not to know in order to avoid the social scandal that would result from publicly acknowledging it. Eliza's position in this arrangement was profoundly precarious. She had no choice about the relationship because refusing Robert's demands would have resulted in punishment or sale. She could not form relationships with men her own age among the enslaved population because Robert would have seen such relationships as encroachments on his property and might have responded violently. She lived in constant awareness that her position depended entirely on Robert's favor, and that if he tired of her, or if Eleanor forced him to end the relationship, Eliza could be sold away at any moment. And she had to perform intimacy and affection toward a man who owned her as property, a psychological burden that would have been crushing, even in addition to the physical exploitation and the constant fear that characterized her daily existence. The material privileges that came with being Harrison's favorite were real, but were far from adequate compensation for the exploitation and vulnerability that defined Eliza's position. She lived in a small cabin adjacent to the main house, rather than in the crowded slave quarters, giving her more privacy and better living conditions than field slaves experienced. She ate food from the main house kitchen, which was better quality and more plentiful than the rations provided to field workers. She had better clothing than other enslaved people, wearing dresses that Eleanor Harrison had tired of, or that Robert purchased specifically for her. She was not required to do the brutal physical labor of field work, and she was rarely subjected to the whippings and other physical punishments that were routinely inflicted on enslaved people who worked in the fields or who were seen as resistant or troublesome. These privileges were visible to other enslaved people and created complicated dynamics where some envied Eliza's position, while others pitied her for the sexual exploitation she endured, and recognized that her privileges came at an enormous psychological and emotional cost. Eliza herself apparently understood that her position, while materially better than field slavery in some respects, was a form of imprisonment that was in some ways worse than the exploitation that field slaves experienced, because it required her to maintain a pretense of willingness and even of affection that must have been soul-destroying. The relationship between Eliza and the other enslaved people at Harrison Plantation was complex and reflected the tensions that the favorite system created within enslaved communities. Some enslaved people, particularly older women who understood what Eliza was experiencing, showed her compassion and tried to provide emotional support despite the risks of being seen associating with someone who is so closely connected to the master. Others, particularly people who resented the privileges that came with Eliza's position, or who believed that she was voluntarily participating in the relationship rather than being coerced, treated her with hostility or avoided her. Eliza apparently had one close friend among the enslaved population, a woman named Sarah who worked in the kitchen and who had known Eliza since childhood. And Sarah would later provide some of the most detailed testimony about Eliza's state of mind in the months before her disappearance. According to Sarah's later accounts, Eliza hated her position and hated Robert Harrison, but she had learned to conceal these feelings completely when in Robert's presence and to perform the role of willing mistress that her survival depended on. Eliza had told Sarah on multiple occasions that she would rather work in the fields and face whippings than continue living as Harrison's favorite, but that she saw no way to escape her situation without being killed or sold to somewhere even worse. The question of whether Eliza was literate and how she might have learned to read and write if she would become important and understanding how she planned her escape attempt. Teaching enslaved people to read and write was illegal in Georgia, as in most southern states, based on the recognition that literacy gave enslaved people access to knowledge and communication that could facilitate resistance and escape. But some enslaved people did learn to read and write through various means, including secret instruction from sympathetic whites, self-teaching using stolen or borrowed books, or learning from other literate enslaved people who passed on knowledge despite the risks. Evidence that emerged after Eliza's death suggested that she had been at least partially literate, able to read simple texts and to write basic messages, though the source of her literacy was never clearly established. It is possible that Thomas Harrison's daughter, Robert's sister, had taught Eliza to read when both were children, following a pattern that occurred occasionally where young white children who had not yet fully internalized racial hierarchies would teach enslaved children they played with. Or Eliza might have taught herself using books and newspapers that she had access to while working in the main house. Either way, her literacy would have been a carefully guarded secret because discovery would have resulted in severe punishment and would have made Robert suspicious that she was planning resistance or escape. The specific planning for Eliza's escape attempt appears to have begun in earnest around 1850, about 2 years before the actual attempt, based on later testimony from enslaved people who had known about her plans and on evidence that was discovered after her death. The catalyst for Eliza deciding to attempt escape was apparently a combination of factors, including Robert's increasing violence toward her as he aged and drank more heavily, the birth of a child that resulted from the relationship, and that Robert immediately sold away because he did not want mixed-race children, who were obviously his own living on the plantation, where they would create complications, and Eliza's developing relationship with a free, black man who lived in the nearest town and who offered her the possibility of a life beyond Harrison's control if she could somehow reach freedom. The free black man, whose name was recorded as Joseph Carter in various documents, worked as a blacksmith and had accumulated enough money to be reasonably secure by the standards of free black people in the antebellum South. Joseph had met Eliza on one of the rare occasions when she accompanied Robert to town and had apparently fallen in love with her, despite knowing that any relationship between them was essentially impossible, given that she was enslaved, and that Robert would kill any man who tried to help her escape. The relationship between Eliza and Joseph was conducted entirely through secret meetings and through messages passed by enslaved people who traveled between the plantation and town, making it extremely dangerous for both of them and for anyone who helped facilitate their communication. The escape plan that Eliza developed over 2 years of preparation was sophisticated and demonstrated considerable strategic thinking about the challenges she would face. Eliza understood that simply running away from the plantation would likely result in her being caught within days by slave patrols and bloodhounds that would track her scent, and that even if she evaded immediate capture, she would need help reaching northern states where she would be legally free, because the hundreds of miles between Georgia and Pennsylvania or Ohio could not be traveled alone by a woman with no resources and no experience navigating through unfamiliar territory. So Eliza's plan involved staying hidden on the plantation property itself for an extended period after her escape, allowing the initial search to move away from the immediate area, while she waited for an opportunity to actually leave when attention had shifted elsewhere, and when she could be transported by Joseph or by Underground Railroad contacts who Joseph was trying to arrange. The plan required identifying a hiding place on the plantation grounds that would not be discovered during searches, but that would be accessible enough that she could survive there for days or potentially weeks. It required accumulating supplies, including food and water, that she could hide in the location before her escape. And it required maintaining absolute secrecy about her intentions, because if Robert or any of the overseers suspected that she was planning to run, they would have increased surveillance to make escape impossible. The hiding place that Eliza selected for her escape plan was a crawl space beneath the smokehouse, a brick building located about 200 feet from the main plantation house that was used for smoking and storing meat. The smokehouse had been built in the 1820s and had a raised floor, supported by brick piers that created a space beneath the building that was approximately 3 feet high, and that was accessed through a small opening at the back of the structure that was normally concealed by vegetation and by equipment stored against the wall. The crawl space was dark, cramped, and uncomfortable, but it had the advantage of being on plantation grounds where searchers would not initially focus their attention once they realized Eliza was missing, and it had some protection from the elements that would have made hiding in the woods more difficult. Eliza had apparently discovered this space while working around the plantation and had identified it as a possible hiding place months before her actual escape attempt. She began slowly stockpiling supplies in the space, including dried food that she stole in small quantities from the main house kitchen, containers for holding water, blankets for warmth, and a small knife that she obtained from somewhere and that she intended to use for self-defense if she was discovered. The accumulation of these supplies required months of careful theft and concealment, taking only small amounts at a time so that the disappearance of items would not be noticed, and hiding them gradually in the crawl space during moments when she could access the area without being observed. The communication between Eliza and Joseph Carter about the escape plan and about when the attempt would be made was facilitated by a network of enslaved people and free black individuals who passed messages despite the enormous risks involved. One of the key messengers was an enslaved man named Benjamin, who worked at a nearby plantation, but who had a past that allowed him to travel to town regularly to conduct errands for his owner, and who used these trips to carry messages between Eliza and Joseph. Another messenger was a free black woman named Harriet, who sold produce in town and who would occasionally visit Harrison Plantation to sell vegetables and who could pass messages during these visits. The existence of such networks demonstrated the sophisticated communication systems that enslaved people maintained, despite constant surveillance and despite the severe punishments that would result if such networks were discovered. Eliza's messages to Joseph conveyed information about her planning progress, about the layout of the plantation and the hiding place she had prepared, and about when she thought conditions might be favorable for making the attempt. Joseph's messages to Eliza provided information about Underground Railroad contacts he was trying to arrange and about his own preparations to help her once she was ready to actually leave the plantation hiding place and begin the journey north. The decision about when to attempt the escape was complicated by multiple factors that Eliza and Joseph had to weigh against each other. The escape needed to happen during a time when weather would be tolerable for someone hiding in an outdoor crawl space without much protection, which meant spring or early fall rather than the heat of summer or the cold of winter. It needed to happen when the moon phase would provide enough light for Eliza to navigate to her hiding place at night without being seen, but not so much light that patrols would be able to easily spot her during the initial escape. It needed to happen at a time when Joseph had made arrangements with Underground Railroad contacts who could help transport Eliza north once she emerged from hiding, arrangements that took time to set up because the network operated cautiously and did not trust easily. And it needed to happen before Robert Harrison's suspicions were aroused, or before circumstances changed in ways that might make the escape impossible. By September 1852, these various factors seemed to align. The weather was still warm enough to make outdoor hiding survivable. Joseph believed he had made progress on arranging transport, and Eliza felt that she could not endure her situation much longer and needed to act before her psychological state deteriorated further. The decision was made that the escape would be attempted on the night of September 15th, 1852, approximately 2 years after Eliza had begun seriously planning. The final days before the escape attempt saw Eliza making last preparations while trying to maintain her normal behavior around Robert and the other white people at the plantation so that no suspicion would be aroused. She added final items to her hidden supplies in the crawl space, including extra water containers and additional food that would allow her to survive for up to 3 weeks if necessary. She sent what she intended to be her final message to Joseph through Benjamin the messenger, letting him know the date of the attempt and telling him that she loved him and hoped she would see him as a free woman. She sent her private goodbyes to Sarah, the enslaved woman who was her closest friend, though she could not tell Sarah the full plan because that knowledge would have endangered Sarah if the escape was discovered and if Robert interrogated people about who had helped. And she steeled herself psychologically for what she knew would be a terrifying and potentially fatal attempt, reminding herself that staying in her current situation was unbearable and that death in pursuit of freedom was preferable to continuing to live as Robert Harrison's property and mistress. The psychological courage required to make this decision, knowing that discovery would mean torture and death, and knowing that even successful escape would require enduring weeks of fear and privation, cannot be overstated. Eliza was preparing to risk everything for a chance at freedom that she knew was extremely unlikely to succeed, but that she had to attempt because the alternative was continuing a life that was destroying her. The night of September 15th, 1852, proceeded in ways that seemed routine to everyone on the plantation except for Eliza herself. Robert Harrison spent the evening drinking whiskey in the main house and called for Eliza around 9 p.m. to attend to him, which was his normal pattern several nights per week. Eliza performed her expected role, serving Robert and submitting to his sexual demands, maintaining the pretense that had kept her alive for years, while knowing that this would be the last time she would ever have to endure such exploitation. Around midnight, Robert dismissed Eliza and told her to return to her cabin, and Eliza left the main house as she had countless times before. But instead of going directly to her cabin, Eliza circled around through the darkness to the smokehouse, located the concealed entrance to the crawl space at the back of the building, and squeezed through the opening into the cramped hiding place where she had stockpiled supplies over the previous months. She pulled vegetation and a board across the entrance to conceal it from anyone who might walk past during searches. And then she settled into the dark, cramped space to wait for the search to begin and then to move away from the immediate plantation area, allowing her to eventually emerge and meet Joseph for the journey north. The plan required her to remain absolutely silent and still during daylight hours when people might be near the smokehouse, and to survive on the limited supplies she had hidden while waiting for the right moment to emerge and flee. Eliza understood that this would be difficult and frightening, but she believed that enduring temporary discomfort and fear was worthwhile for a chance at permanent freedom. The discovery of Eliza's disappearance came the next morning, September 16th, when an enslaved woman who brought breakfast to Eliza's cabin found it empty and found that Eliza's few possessions were still present, suggesting that she had not simply moved somewhere else on the plantation, but had actually fled. The woman reported this to the overseer, who reported it to Robert Harrison, and Robert's response was immediate and violent. He flew into a rage that terrified everyone who witnessed it, shouting that Eliza had betrayed him and that whoever had helped her escape would be killed. He immediately mobilized the plantation's overseers and sent messages to neighboring plantations requesting their assistance in searching for Eliza and in questioning their enslaved people about whether they had seen her or knew about any escape plans. He sent a messenger to the county seat to alert the sheriff and to arrange for professional slave catchers to be hired. And he personally interrogated every enslaved person on Harrison Plantation, using threats and violence to try to extract information about how Eliza had escaped and who had helped her. Several enslaved people were whipped during these interrogations, not because they were actually suspected of helping Eliza, but because Robert wanted to terrorize the entire enslaved community into revealing any information they might have and into preventing others from considering escape. No useful information was obtained from these interrogations because the people who actually knew about Eliza's plans, Sarah, Benjamin, and a few others, maintained absolute silence despite the pain and fear they experienced, understanding that revealing what they knew would not only endanger themselves, but would likely result in Eliza being caught and killed. The search for Eliza during the first days after her disappearance focused on areas away from the plantation itself, based on the assumption that she must have fled the immediate area and was trying to reach either a town where she might blend in with other black people or a wilderness area where she could hide until making contact with underground railroad networks. Slave patrols searched roads and paths within a 20-mile radius of Harrison Plantation, stopping any black people they encountered and checking their papers to ensure they had permission to be traveling. Bloodhounds were brought from a neighboring plantation and were given Eliza's scent from clothing in her cabin, and the dogs were used to try to track her trail, though they seemed confused and did not establish a clear direction of travel. Professional slave catchers who made their living tracking and capturing escaped enslaved. People were hired for substantial fees and began conducting systematic searches of the surrounding countryside, checking with informants and searching areas where fugitives were known to hide. The reward that Robert Harrison offered, $500 for Eliza's return, was publicized throughout the region and was substantial enough that many people who had no professional involvement in slave catching began looking for her in hopes of claiming the reward. All of this searching activity, involving hundreds of men over the first week after the disappearance, found no trace of Eliza and produced no credible leads about where she might have gone. This was frustrating and puzzling to the searchers, and particularly to Robert Harrison, who could not understand how a young woman with no experience navigating the wilderness and with no obvious connections to underground railroad networks could have simply vanished without leaving any trail. What none of the searchers realized during these first days and weeks was that Eliza had not actually left the plantation property at all, and was hiding less than 200 feet from the main house in a location that searchers either did not think to check carefully or that they checked so perfunctorily that they did not discover the concealed entrance to the crawl space beneath the smokehouse. During those first days of searching, Eliza remained in the cramped, dark hiding space, listening to the sounds of searchers moving around the chars, plantation grounds, and listening to the dogs barking as they tried to pick up her scent. She remained absolutely still and silent during daylight hours when people were active around the plantation, not moving even to stretch her cramped muscles or to relieve herself, because she feared that any sound might draw attention to her location. She rationed her food and water carefully, understanding that she needed to make her supplies last as long as possible while waiting for the search to move away from the immediate area. The physical discomfort was intense. The crawl space was too low to stand in or even to sit up fully, forcing her to lie down or to crouch in positions that were painful after hours. The temperature fluctuated dramatically between cold nights and hot days when the sun beat down on the brick building above her, and the darkness and isolation were psychologically taxing. But Eliza endured all of this, believing that her suffering was temporary, and that once the initial search intensity decreased, she would be able to emerge and make her way to meet Joseph and begin the journey to actual freedom. The week following Eliza's disappearance saw the search expanding geographically as it became clear that she was not going to be found in the immediate vicinity of Harrison Plantation. Slave catchers spread throughout Georgia and into neighboring South Carolina and Alabama, checking with their networks of informants and contacts and offering money for information about any sightings of a young, light-skinned black woman traveling alone or with companions. The Underground Railroad was put on alert that Harrison was actively searching for Eliza, and that anyone caught helping her would face prosecution and violence. Free black communities in towns throughout the region were harassed by authorities, who suspected them of helping fugitive enslaved people and who conducted searches and interrogations designed to intimidate people into providing information or into refusing to help fugitives. Joseph Carter, Eliza's lover, who was waiting for word from her and who had expected to be contacted within days of her escape, became increasingly worried as no message arrived, and as he heard about the intensity of the search that Harrison had launched. Joseph understood that trying to contact Eliza or to search for her himself would be extremely dangerous because he was known to have been in contact with her and because Harrison would kill him if any connection between them was discovered. So Joseph waited anxiously, hoping that Eliza had successfully escaped and was simply unable to make contact yet, but fearing that something terrible had happened to her. By the end of the first week after the disappearance, September 23rd, the search had produced absolutely no leads, and Robert Harrison was becoming increasingly desperate and enraged. He increased the reward to $750, making Eliza one of the most valuable fugitives in the South and ensuring that enormous numbers of people would continue searching for her. He personally traveled to several neighboring counties to coordinate search efforts and to meet with slave catchers and sheriffs who he thought might be able to help. He began to suspect that Eliza must have received help from abolitionists or Underground Railroad operatives who were more sophisticated than he had initially believed, and he started directing search efforts toward known abolitionist sympathizers and toward areas where the Underground Railroad was active. Harrison also began to suspect that someone on his own plantation must have helped Eliza escape, and he conducted a second round of interrogations that were even more violent than the first, subjecting several enslaved people to extended whippings and to other tortures in attempts to extract confessions. But still no useful information was obtained, because the people who knew Eliza's actual plan understood that revealing it would be catastrophic for everyone involved, and because the intensity of Harrison's violence actually reinforced their determination to resist his interrogations and to protect Eliza's secret as long as possible. The second week after Eliza's disappearance, from September 23rd through September 30th, saw the search gradually becoming less intense as it became clear that Eliza was not going to be found through the massive mobilization of resources that Harrison had organized. Slave catchers began to reduce their efforts as they realized that the easy money they had hoped to make was not going to materialize, and some of them moved on to other cases that seemed more promising. The bloodhounds had lost any scent trail days earlier and were no longer useful for the search. The patrols that had been checking roads and paths relaxed their vigilance somewhat as the days passed without any credible sightings. Harrison himself, while still enraged and determined to find Eliza, had to return his attention to managing his plantation and to other business matters that had been neglected during the week of intensive searching. The enslaved people at Harrison Plantation began to cautiously hope that Eliza had somehow succeeded in escaping despite the odds and despite the massive search, and they began to quietly celebrate her apparent success, even while mourning the likelihood that they would never see her again or know what had happened to her. Sarah, Eliza's close friend, was particularly hopeful and prayed that Eliza had reached Joseph and was on her way to freedom, though Sarah also worried that she had heard nothing from Eliza and had no way of knowing whether the silence meant success or disaster. What Sarah and the others did not know, and what Robert Harrison and his searchers did not realize, was that Eliza was still hiding in the crawl space beneath the smokehouse, enduring nearly 2 weeks of confinement in the dark, cramped space and slowly exhausting her supplies of food and water. The plan had been for Eliza to remain hidden for approximately 1 week while the initial search intensity peaked and then faded, and then to emerge and make her way to a predetermined meeting place where Joseph would be waiting to help her continue her escape. But several factors had prevented Eliza from executing this plan according to schedule. First, the search had been far more intense than she had anticipated, with people moving around the plantation grounds constantly during the first week and making it impossible for her to safely emerge from hiding without being seen. Second, the entrance to the crawl space, which she had concealed with vegetation and a board when she entered, had apparently been disturbed by someone or something, and had become more completely sealed than she had intended, making it difficult for her to push it open from inside the cramped space, where she had limited leverage and limited ability to move. Third, and most critically, Eliza's water supply had proven insufficient for her needs, and she was becoming severely dehydrated after nearly 2 weeks in the hot, airless crawl space without adequate fluid intake. By the end of the second week, Eliza was in desperate condition, but was unable to call for help without revealing her location and without guaranteeing that she would be captured and likely killed. She was trapped, dying slowly in the darkness, just a few hundred feet from the main house where Robert Harrison was planning the next phase of his search for her. The third week after Eliza's disappearance, from October 1st through October 8th, saw the search continuing at a much reduced level compared to the immediate aftermath of her escape. Most of the professional slave catchers had moved on to other work, though a few continued following up on tips and rumors, in hopes of claiming the $750 reward that Harrison was still offering. The patrols checking roads and paths had largely returned to their normal activities, no longer stopping every black traveler they encountered. The Underground Railroad networks that had been on alert for Eliza, or for anyone helping her, began to assume that she had either been caught and the capture had not been publicized, or that she had successfully escaped through some other route and was beyond the reach of Harrison's searchers. Joseph Carter continued waiting and hoping for word from Eliza, but he was beginning to fear that she had not survived the escape attempt and that he would never know what had happened to her. The enslaved people at Harrison Plantation were trying to return to normal routines after the destruction and violence of the first 2 weeks, though they remained traumatized by the interrogations they had endured and remained uncertain about what had happened to Eliza. And Robert Harrison, while still enraged by Eliza's disappearance and still determined to find her, had been forced to acknowledge that she was not going to be easily recovered, and that he might never learn what had become of her or who had helped her escape. On October 8, 1852, 23 days after Eliza's disappearance, an overseer named James Miller was conducting routine inspections of plantation buildings and was checking the smokehouse to assess whether repairs were needed before the fall hog slaughter when he noticed a smell near the back of the building that he initially assumed was from some animal that had died nearby. The smell was strong enough and distinctive enough that Miller decided to investigate more closely, and he began moving equipment and vegetation that was stored against the back wall of the smokehouse. As he cleared this material away, he discovered the board that concealed the entrance to the crawl space beneath the building. and he noticed that the smell was much stronger near this opening. Miller removed the board and looked into the crawl space. And even in the dim light, he could see what appeared to be a body lying motionless in the space. Miller immediately ran to get other overseers and to alert Robert Harrison that something had been found. And within minutes, several men had gathered at the smokehouse to investigate. They widened the opening to the crawl space and used lamps to illuminate the interior, revealing what they had feared and what none of them had anticipated. Eliza's body, dead for at least a week, and possibly longer based on the state of decomposition, lying in the cramped space where she had apparently been hiding since her disappearance. The discovery of Eliza's body in the crawl space beneath the smokehouse was shocking to everyone at Harrison Plantation, because no one had suspected that she might never have left the plantation property at all, and because finding her dead so close to the main house, after 3 weeks of intensive searching that had covered hundreds of square miles, seemed almost impossible to believe. The initial response was confusion about what had happened and how Eliza had died, though the circumstances suggested that she had hidden in the crawl space intentionally as part of an escape plan and had somehow become trapped or unable to emerge and had died there. Robert Harrison's response to the discovery was complex and revealed the toxic mixture of emotions that characterized his relationship with Eliza. He was clearly distressed by her death and appeared to experience genuine grief, suggesting that despite the exploitative and abusive nature of their relationship, he had developed some emotional attachment to her that went beyond merely viewing her as property. But Harrison was also enraged that Eliza had attempted to escape and that she had deceived him so completely, hiding on his own property for weeks while he searched desperately for her elsewhere. And he was humiliated that this situation had occurred and that his property had died within feet of the main house while he had mobilized massive resources searching for her in distant locations. This humiliation was compounded by the recognition that other enslaved people on his plantation must have known about Eliza's plans and had helped her, or at least had not revealed what they knew, despite the violence he had inflicted during interrogations. The removal of Eliza's body from the crawl space and the examination of the scene provided evidence about what had happened during her weeks in hiding and about how she had died. The cramped space showed signs that Eliza had been living there for an extended period. There were containers for food and water that were now empty. There were blankets that she had used for warmth, and there were marks on the wooden beams above her, where she had apparently tried to keep track of the days by making small scratches. Most disturbingly, there was extensive evidence that Eliza had tried desperately to escape from the crawl space during the final days or weeks of her life. The board that concealed the entrance had deep scratch marks on its interior side, where Eliza had tried to pry it open with her hands and with the small knife that was found near her body. The ground beneath the entrance showed evidence of digging where Eliza had tried to widen the opening enough to crawl out. And Eliza's hands were bloodied, and her fingernails were broken from her attempts to force open the entrance that had apparently become sealed more completely than she had intended, and that she could not open from inside the confined space, where she had limited leverage and limited ability to move or exert force. The evidence painted a horrific picture of Eliza spending days or even weeks trapped in the dark, airless crawl space, slowly dying from dehydration and starvation, while trying desperately to escape, and while able to hear people moving around outside the smokehouse, but unable to call for help without guaranteeing her recapture. The medical examination of Eliza's body, conducted by a doctor who was brought to the plantation to determine cause of death, concluded that she had died from dehydration and possibly also from heat exposure in the confined space. The doctor estimated that death had occurred approximately 1 week before the body was discovered, meaning that Eliza had survived in the hiding place for approximately 16 days after entering it on September 15th, before dying around October 1st. This timeline was consistent with how long someone might survive with limited water in hot conditions, and it suggested that Eliza's death had been slow and agonizing as her body gradually shut down from lack of fluids. The doctor noted that Eliza's body showed signs of severe dehydration, including sunken features and dark discoloration, and that there was evidence of trauma to her hands from her attempts to escape. The official cause of death was recorded as accidental death from dehydration and exposure while attempting to abscond, language that obscured the fact that Eliza's death was actually the result of slavery's violence and of her desperate attempt to escape sexual exploitation that she could not endure any longer. The examination was perfunctory and did not include any serious investigation into whether Eliza could have been saved if the crawl space had been discovered earlier, or whether anyone bore responsibility for her death beyond Eliza herself for attempting to escape. The response of the enslaved community at Harrison Plantation to the discovery of Eliza's body was profound grief mixed with horror at what she had endured and with guilt that no one had been able to help her or even to know that she was dying so close to where they lived and worked. Sarah, Eliza's closest friend, was devastated by the news and blamed herself for not realizing that something had gone wrong with the escape plan and for not finding some way to check on Eliza or to help her. Other enslaved people who had known about the escape plan in general terms also experienced guilt and grief, wondering if there was anything they could have done differently that might have saved Eliza's life. But these feelings had to be concealed or expressed only in the most private and careful ways, because showing excessive grief for proof, Eliza would have made Robert Harrison suspicious that the grieving person had been involved in the escape attempt and might result in punishment. So the enslaved community mourned Eliza in secret, gathering in the quarters at night to remember her and to pray for her soul and to express their rage at a system that had driven her to such a desperate escape attempt and that had ultimately killed her. The story of what had happened to Eliza spread rapidly through the networks that connected enslaved people across plantations, becoming part of the oral tradition that preserved knowledge about slavery's horrors, even when official records obscured or lied about what had actually occurred. The burial of Eliza's body was conducted quickly and with minimal ceremony, following the pattern for deceased enslaved people whose deaths were not considered significant events deserving of elaborate ritual. Robert Harrison ordered that Eliza be buried in the enslaved people's cemetery at the edge of the plantation property, in an unmarked grave that would not be distinguished from dozens of other graves of enslaved people who had died at Harrison Plantation over the decades. No minister was brought to conduct services because enslaved. People's spiritual needs were considered unimportant by the plantation administration. No coffin was provided because that expense was not considered worthwhile for deceased enslaved people. Eliza's body was wrapped in a simple cloth and placed in a hole that had been dug by other enslaved people, and the grave was filled in and left unmarked except for a simple wooden marker that would deteriorate within a few years. The only people who attended the burial were other enslaved, people who knew Eliza and who wanted to pay their respects despite the danger of showing too much grief or attachment that might arouse Harrison's suspicions. Sarah was there, and later described how she had to force herself not to cry openly, because doing so might have revealed to Harrison that she had known Eliza well and might have implicated her in the escape attempt. The burial was completed quickly, and everyone returned to their work, trying to act as though nothing significant had occurred, even though they were grieving deeply for a friend who had died trying to escape a form of slavery that was more intimate and more psychologically destructive than field work. Robert Harrison's response to Eliza's death included elements that demonstrated the complicated and toxic nature of his feelings about her. He was genuinely distressed by her death and apparently felt some form of loss that went beyond simple financial calculation about losing valuable property. He ordered that the crawl space beneath the smokehouse be permanently sealed so that no one else could hide there. And he apparently avoided walking near the smokehouse for weeks after the discovery because the location reminded him of what had happened. But Harrison also directed his distress toward anger at Eliza for betraying him by attempting to escape and toward suspicion of other enslaved people who he believed must have helped her. He conducted a third round of interrogations that were even more violent than the previous rounds, demanding that people confess what they knew about Eliza's plans and threatening to sell people away from their families or to have them whipped to death if they did not cooperate. This violence produced no useful information because the people who had actually helped Eliza maintained their silence, and because most enslaved people genuinely had not known the details of her plans. But the violence reinforced the atmosphere of terror that characterized Harrison Plantation and ensured that Eliza's death would haunt the enslaved community for years to come as a reminder of the price that could be paid for attempting to escape, and as a symbol of slavery's capacity to destroy people who dared to seek freedom. The cover-up of the true circumstances of Eliza's death began almost immediately after her body was discovered and was motivated by Robert. Harrison's desire to avoid the embarrassment and scandal that would result if the full story became known. The fact that Eliza had been Harrison's mistress was not publicly acknowledged, but was widely known in the local community. And if word spread that she had attempted to escape and had died trapped in a hiding place on Harrison's own property while he was searching desperately for her elsewhere, Harrison would become a laughingstock among other slaveholders and might face questions about how he managed his enslaved people and about whether his inappropriate relationship with Eliza had contributed to her escape attempt. So Harrison created a false narrative about what had happened and worked to ensure that this false narrative was the story that would be remembered and recorded. According to the official story that Harrison promoted, Eliza had run away from the plantation on September 15th, had been pursued by slave catchers and patrols, had become lost in the woods or swamps in the area, and had died from exposure or from drowning or from some other cause before she could be captured. The discovery of her body in the crawl space was either omitted entirely from this narrative or was explained as Eliza having returned to the plantation in a confused or desperate state and having hidden there before dying. This false narrative was the story that was told to neighboring plantation owners, to authorities who had helped with the search, and to anyone else who asked about what had happened to the escaped enslaved woman who had been the subject of such an intensive search effort. The enforcement of this false narrative required Robert Harrison to threaten and to coerce the enslaved people at his plantation into maintaining silence about what had actually happened. Every enslaved person who had been present when Eliza's body was discovered, or who had been involved in the burial, or who had any knowledge about the circumstances of her death, was explicitly warned that speaking about these matters to anyone outside the plantation would result in severe punishment. Harrison made examples of several people who he suspected of being too sympathetic to Eliza or too willing to gossip about her death, having them whipped publicly and threatening them with sail away from their families if they did not learn to keep silent. This atmosphere of enforced silence was effective in preventing word of the true circumstances from spreading immediately, but it could not prevent the story from being preserved in the oral traditions of the enslaved community and eventually from being passed down to future generations who would record it and who would ensure that Eliza's true story would not be completely erased by Harrison's attempts at concealment. The enslaved people who knew what had really happened maintained their silence publicly while privately preserving the memory of Eliza and of her desperate escape attempt and of the horror of her death, understanding that someday the truth would be important and would need to be remembered and told. The impact of Eliza's death on Joseph Carter, her lover who had been helping her plan the escape and who had been waiting for her to contact him, was devastating and created trauma that apparently lasted for the rest of his life. Joseph had waited for weeks after Eliza's disappearance, hoping for some word from her or some sign that she had successfully escaped, and gradually coming to fear that something terrible had happened. When he finally learned through the networks that connected free black people and enslaved people that Eliza had died trapped in a hiding place on Harrison's plantation, Joseph was overwhelmed with grief and with guilt that he had not been able to save her or even to know that she was dying so close to where he had been waiting. Joseph apparently tried to confront Robert Harrison about what had happened to Eliza and about Harrison's responsibility for her death. But this was extremely dangerous for a free black man to do, and Joseph was warned by friends that pursuing such a confrontation would likely result in his own death or enslavement. Joseph eventually had to accept that he could not get justice for Eliza or even public acknowledgement of what had happened to her, and he had to live with the knowledge that the woman he loved had died in horrific circumstances while trying to reach him, and while he had been completely unable to help her. According to later testimony from people who knew Joseph, he never married or formed another serious relationship after Eliza's death, and he carried the guilt and grief about what had happened for the rest of his life. The documentation of Eliza's true story was preserved initially through the oral traditions of the enslaved community at Harrison Plantation and in the surrounding area, with people who had known her passing down the story of her relationship with Robert Harrison, of her escape attempt, and of her death trapped in the crawl space beneath the smokehouse. This oral preservation was essential because official records either omitted the story entirely or presented the false narrative that Harrison had created, and because no written accounts from enslaved people's perspectives were created at the time, because literacy among enslaved people was illegal, and because people who might have been inclined to write about what happened were prevented from doing so by fear of punishment. The story was passed down through multiple generations, from people who had known Eliza directly to their children and grandchildren, and it was maintained with remarkable consistency in terms of the basic facts, even as specific details were sometimes lost or altered through the process of oral transmission. The story was remembered not just as an individual tragedy, but as a representative example of the sexual exploitation and violence that characterized slavery, and as evidence of enslaved people's willingness to risk everything for freedom, even when the chances of success were minimal. The rediscovery of Eliza's story by historians occurred in the 20th century as researchers studying slavery began systematically collecting oral histories from elderly African Americans whose parents or grandparents had been enslaved and who had preserved knowledge about slavery's realities that official records had obscured or lied about. In the 1930s, as part of the Federal Writers Project, interviewers recorded testimony from formerly enslaved people and from their descendants, and several of these interviews included references to Eliza's case, though not always with her name or with complete details. In the 1960s and 1970s, as the civil rights movement inspired renewed interest in African American history and in the realities of slavery that previous generations of historians had minimized, researchers began making systematic efforts to recover stories like Eliza's and to validate them through comparison with available documentary evidence. A Harrison Plantation property had changed hands multiple times since Robert Harrison's death, and records from the plantation during the 1850s were fragmentary. But researchers were able to find enough corroborating evidence, including estate inventories that listed Eliza as property, newspaper notices about the reward offered for her capture, and references in private letters and diaries from people in the area to confirm that the basic outline of the story, preserved in oral tradition, was accurate and that Eliza had been a real person who had died in circumstances similar to what the oral histories described. The physical evidence that validated aspects of Eliza's story was discovered in the 1980s when archaeologists conducting a survey of the former Harrison Plantation site investigated the remains of the smokehouse building and found the crawl space that had been sealed after Eliza's death. This space was exactly as oral histories had described it, a cramped area beneath the building, approximately 3 feet high and accessible through an opening at the back wall that had been permanently boarded up. The archaeologists found evidence consistent with the space having been used as a hiding place, including remnants of containers that might have held food or water and marks on wooden beams that could have been made by someone tracking days or trying to force an opening. No human remains were present, because Eliza's body had been removed and buried elsewhere in 1852, but the physical evidence of the space itself and of marks consistent with someone trying to escape from it provided powerful corroboration of what oral histories had preserved. The discovery led to more extensive research into Eliza's case and to eventual publication of scholarly articles and books that documented her story and that placed it in the broader context of sexual exploitation under slavery and of resistance. Attempts that failed, but that demonstrated enslaved people's refusal to accept their oppression passively. The question of how common cases like Eliza's were, enslaved women attempting to escape sexual exploitation and dying in the attempt, cannot be answered with precision because such cases were often concealed by slaveholders who did not want to acknowledge that their favorite slaves were desperate enough to risk death rather than continue serving them. But the available evidence suggests that Eliza's experience, while unique in its specific details, was representative of broader patterns. Many enslaved women were kept as slaveholders' mistresses and endured years or even lifetimes of sexual exploitation that they could not refuse without risking violence or sale. Some of these women attempted to escape, and many of those attempts failed, resulting in recapture and punishment or in death during the escape attempt. The deaths were usually not investigated seriously and were recorded with euphemistic language that obscured what had actually happened. Eliza's case is unusual, primarily because her story was preserved in enough detail that it could be validated and documented by later historians rather than being lost completely, as countless other similar stories were lost. Every unmarked grave in enslaved people's cemeteries throughout the South potentially represents a story like Eliza's, a person who died trying to escape oppression that was unbearable and whose death was concealed or misrepresented in official records to protect the reputations of the people who had enslaved them. The legacy of Eliza's story in contemporary discussions about slavery's sexual violence and about enslaved people's resistance includes its use as a specific documented example that illustrates broader patterns, and that helps make abstract historical claims about slavery more concrete and personal. When historians or educators describe how enslaved women were sexually exploited by slaveholders, and how some women attempted to escape this exploitation, they can point to Eliza's case as a specific documented example with a name, a date, and a detailed narrative that allows students and readers to understand what such abstract descriptions actually meant in human terms. Eliza becomes a symbol representing the thousands or possibly millions of enslaved women who endured similar exploitation and who made similar escape attempts, most of whose names and stories are lost, but whose experiences were real and whose suffering deserves to be remembered. The use of individual stories like Eliza's to represent broader patterns is valuable for making history accessible and for creating emotional connections that abstract statistics cannot achieve, though it also raises questions about the ethics of using individual tragedies as representative examples and about whether such use risks instrumentalizing people's suffering for pedagogical purposes rather than honoring them as individuals. What should we remember about Eliza and about the horror of what happened to her when she attempted to escape sexual slavery? We should remember that she was born into slavery in 1828 and was made Robert, Harrison's mistress as a teenager, enduring years of sexual exploitation that she could not refuse without risking death or sale. We should remember that she planned an escape for 2 years, carefully accumulating supplies and coordinating with allies, demonstrating intelligence and strategic thinking that racist assumptions claimed enslaved people did not possess. We should remember that she attempted to escape on September 15, 1852, hiding in a crawl space beneath a smokehouse on the plantation property, while a massive search looked for her elsewhere. We should remember that she became trapped in that space when the entrance sealed more completely than she intended, and when her supplies proved insufficient for her needs. We should remember that she died slowly over approximately 16 days from dehydration and heat exposure, while trying desperately to escape from the crawl space, scratching at the entrance until her hands bled and her fingernails broke. We should remember that her body was discovered on October 8, 1852, 23 days after her disappearance, just 200 feet from the main house where Robert Harrison had been planning the search for her. We should remember that Harrison covered up the true circumstances of her death to avoid embarrassment, and that he enforced silence among enslaved people who knew what had happened. We should remember that Eliza's story was preserved through oral tradition despite this attempted cover-up, and was eventually validated by historians and archaeologists. And we should remember that Eliza represents countless other enslaved people who attempted to escape and who died in the attempt, whose stories are lost, but whose resistance to oppression deserves to be recognized and honored. What do you think about Eliza's escape attempt, and about the tragic way it ended, with her dying trapped in a hiding place on the very property she was trying to flee? How should we judge Robert Harrison's responsibility for her death, given that he created the conditions that made her desperate to escape, and given that his search might have found her alive if he had checked his own property more carefully? What does Eliza's story tell us about the psychological impact of sexual exploitation under slavery, and about why some enslaved women chose death over continuing to endure such exploitation? How should we remember women like Eliza, whose escape attempts failed, but who demonstrated courage and determination in their refusal to accept their oppression? And what responsibility do we have to recover and preserve stories like Eliza's that powerful people tried to erase from history? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If Eliza's story of escape that ended in horror challenged your understanding of slavery's sexual violence and demonstrated enslaved people's willingness to risk death rather than continue enduring oppression, hit that subscribe button for Epic of Fear and smash the notification bell. We are committed to recovering the stories that slaveholders tried to bury, to honoring people like Eliza, whose courage deserves to be remembered even when their attempts at freedom ended tragically, and to ensuring that the full truth about slavery's violence is never forgotten or minimized. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that being a slaveholder's favorite was not a privilege, but was a particularly cruel form of slavery that some women found unbearable enough that they would risk death trying to escape. Eliza disappeared overnight. They found her weeks later trapped beneath the smokehouse, where she died slowly trying to escape. Remember her. Remember her courage. Remember that she chose death over continuing to live as Robert Harrison's property. And remember that her story represents thousands of women whose names we will never know, but whose resistance to slavery's sexual violence deserves to be acknowledged and honored. Hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next investigation. Because at Epoch of Fear, we believe that every victim of slavery's violence deserves to be remembered, that every act of resistance deserves to be honored even when it failed, and that historical truth must be preserved even when powerful people work to conceal it. Remember Eliza. Remember September 1852. Remember what slavery did to her and to millions like her. Subscribe now